We'll open with taking refuge and generating bodhicitta in the usual manner, once in English, 2 times in the chant. I take refuge until I am enlightened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the positive potential I create by listening to teachings and the other paramitas, may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. Sangye chedang sogi chognam la Jangchu bardu dagni kyapsu chi Dagi jinso gibe sonam hi Drola penchir sangye drupashu Sangye chedang sogi chognam la Yangchu bardu dagni kyapsu chi Dagi jinso gipe sonam ki Drola penchir sangye drupasho. And this represents taking refuge in the Buddha and the Dharma and the Sangha. And taking refuge, it means we've chosen this because we see it as a safe direction that we can take in this universe that has so many options that we can take, and some of those options will lead to tremendous suffering. So this is a safe direction we can take. Now we go to the 4 immeasurable thoughts, and for those of us who have looked at the Chenrezig figure and sort of have memorized the qualities there. Visualize Chenrezig here, because Chenrezig is the embodiment of immeasurable love, immeasurable compassion, immeasurable joy, and immeasurable equanimity. And this is directed toward all sentient beings. So we think of all sentient beings as we say these lines. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And now I've been inserting the Manjushri mantra. Manjushri is the Buddha of wisdom. And for those of you who are familiar with that figure, you can visualize this figure as we say the Manjushri mantra, which is Om, A, Ra, Pa, Sa, Na, Di. And I'm going to briefly explain what each of these syllables means. You won't remember it, but just hear this now and know that when we're saying Om, A, Ra, Pa, Sa, Na, Di, this is what we're talking about. So Om is the essence of our beginningless nature that is capable of transforming. We are capable of changing. We're capable of transforming. That is the nature of the universe, actually. It is a dependent arising phenomena, and it can change. Ah represents the empty, dependently arising nature of self and phenomena that is beginningless and uncreated. That's Ah, Om Ah. Ra represents the empty, dependently arising nature of self and phenomena that is uncorrupted and stainless. So the actual process of dependent arising is an uncorrupted, stainless process. It just occurs. It is. Then the next syllable is Pa, and this represents the empty nature of self and phenomena that is the ultimate reality. The ultimate truth of what everything is. Empty nature of self and phenomena. Dependent arising. Sa represents the empty nature of self and phenomena that does not die and is not reborn. So this process of dependent arising that's constantly, moment to moment happening, it doesn't stop with death and it doesn't begin with birth. It is always there. Na, the next syllable, Om Ra Pa Sa Na, represents the names that we give to self and phenomena, and that those names are merely labels that we are applying to the empty nature of the objects that we're applying the names to. So the objects themselves are empty of any kind of independent self-existence. They are dependent arisings, constantly changing moment to moment. And then the final syllable is D, and this represents the fact that we can awaken our Buddha nature. We can awaken the dependent arising aspect of our nature that works toward complete awakening and liberation from suffering, and to be able to help other beings. So that's D. And when we repeat D, 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 at the end of this mantra, we think that we are awakening in ourselves this choice to use dependent arising as a means to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And we'll be talking about this in the story of Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan that we're going to class. This is Merit. You know Merit. Okay, so here's the mantra. Om Ra Pa Sa Na Di. And we'll do a few of these. And at the very last repetition, when we come to D, we'll repeat that D over and over a few times. And remember, it's awakening. We're awakening within ourselves the choice to use dependent arising nature to become enlightened. Yes.
Would you just do one syllable at a time and do like say it and then have us repeat it just slowly?
Om.
Oh.
Ah.
Ah.
Ra.
Ra.
Pa.
Ha.
Sa.
Sa.
Na.
Na.
D.
D.
Then D at the very
At the
end.
very
Yeah.
end.
Okay. So here we go.
Okay, thanks.
So if you are familiar with the Manjushri figure, you can imagine the Manjushri figure. Oma Rapa Sandadi, 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 Oma Rapa Sandadi. Oma Rapa Sandadi, Oma Rapa Sandadi, Oma Rapa Sandadi, Oma Rapa Sandadi, Oma Rapa Sandadi. Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi. The Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi, Oma Rapatsanadi. Okay. Now we go to we'll just recite this 7-limb prayer. If you're familiar with the 7-limb prayer and the practice that goes along with it, you can visualize that briefly as we say this prayer. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and present clouds of every type of offering, actual and mentally transformed. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and rejoice in the merits of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until samsara ends, and turn the wheel of Dharma for sentient beings. I dedicate the merit created by myself and others to the great enlightenment. And then finally, we imagine a system of being, universal system, you might say, where all consciousnesses and appearances have been purified of afflictive emotions and cognitive obscurations, and the entire system of consciousness and appearances is working in a perfectly balanced and wholesome, dependently and interdependent way. And so we imagine that as we say this mandala offering. Sajivaki Jokshin Mento Tramri Rablingji Nidegen Padi Sangye Jindu Nideruwagi Rakunam Dakshinam Chapasho. And we say Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatai. Okay, today we're going to be I'm going to be telling a story, and it's a true story. It's about Helen Keller and her teacher, Anne Sullivan. And stories are really valuable ways for us to get engaged in something and to remember it later. Geshe Draka, whenever he would want us to remember something that was important, he would tell a story. And we'd all remember the story, and sometimes we'd forget what the point of the story was. And so you'd go over the story again and then, oh yeah, that's what he was saying. So that is the purpose of this, because in the past few classes we've been having, we've been talking about some pretty mind-boggling topics, and they have to do with the Buddhist psychological pathway that we take to achieve liberation from our afflictive emotions and suffering and attain an awakened state, an awakened heart and mind that has the ability to help all other beings. So that includes, so that we talked about things that include the nature of existence. Aside from psychology, the mind and behavior, we talked about the nature of existence itself, because it's all included within the psychological path the Buddha is talking about. Then we talked about the nature of reality. The reality is beginningless. It doesn't have, we want it to have a beginning, but it isn't beginning. So we got into concepts about beginninglessness. We talked about even God. Is God a first cause? And if you define God, it depends on how the terms are defined. If God is defined as that which is, how do we say, the ultimate reality and truth, ultimate reality and truth. If that's how God is defined, that's perfect. That fits completely within the Buddhist view. So really, if you want to think about God, which God will come up in this story, think of it in terms of being the ultimate nature of what reality actually is.
Not creator.
Not an independent individual person, but the nature of reality itself. And that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And the word itself, once you take that and that label stands for that idea, then there's absolutely no problem with it. And then the final thing, well, anyway, existence, nature of reality, we talk about these concepts, and they're very hard to wrap our minds around. So what I thought was we would take a story, and this particular story, and use this story of Helen Keller and her teacher, Anne Sullivan, as an analogy for the actual, I shouldn't say predicament, but predicament or situation we currently find ourselves in, which is sort of a darkness of ignorance that has yet to realize what the actual nature of reality is. Mm-hmm. And this story is a perfect analogy of the teacher-student relationship, and how a teacher goes through their own process, and through that own process, their own process is then able to help the student in ways that are skillful and appropriate for that particular student. Mm-hmm. And this story is fantastic, and I'm hoping that we'll remember this, and it will help in our understanding of the process we ourselves are going through, and how our teachers, how they are helping us, the ways they're helping us. So,
real quick, you hit record, right?
I did hit record.
Perfect.
Yeah. So here's the analogy for beginningless ignorance and the path to enlightenment. Now, I'll probably be reading most of this because I was up till 5.
Oh my goodness.
Writing, and there was a lot of research involved. So, okay, because it's a true story, and I wanted to have verification of it. Ego self-grasping and the ignorance that drives us is so primordial within our subjective consciousness that it's almost impossible for us to have an objective idea of what ego self-grasping is, because it's who we are. It's hard for us to look at it objectively and recognize it for what it is, for what it actually is. So, and let alone imagine that there's anything we could possibly do about it, because we think, this is just the way things are. This is just the way everybody is. This is what is. This is reality, okay? We're all grasping for what we want. We all want to be happy. And when we don't get what we want, we kick and scream, and we get frustrated and we, sort of get disillusioned with our life. And that's just the way it is. And the Buddha is saying, no, there is another way, but you have to have a realization of it and see what that thing is. So this is what the story of this true story of Helen Keller and her teacher represents. And it's a rich analogy that helps us to grasp the nature of the situation that we currently find ourselves in. So here is, and I've labeled this story From Darkness to Light, the story of Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. And many of you know, Helen Keller, when I was a kid, everybody knew who she was, world famous. There were even Helen Keller jokes that the kids told, So, I, as a little kid, knew exactly who Helen Keller was, and most people do. This is why this makes such a good analogy for us. Helen Keller was born in 1880 in Alabama, part of the Deep South in the U.S. that after the Civil War in ended in 1865, that area suffered from economic hardship and racial tensions and all kinds of things like that. And that was what Helen Keller was born into. Her father, Arthur Keller, had served as a captain in the Confederate Army, and her mother's father was a Confederate general. So they were steeped. It was a Confederate family steeped in the Confederacy. They had owned slaves, the whole deal, So this is what Helen Keller was born into. So if you want to say even that as an analogy for, sort of a kind of a ignorance of a heart that recognizes the, equanimity, that we're all equal here. That situation represents this kind of ignorance that we have. At 6 months, Helen showed lots of signs of being an eager and bright toddler. According to her family, she could say howdy, and she could say, when there was tea, she could say tea, 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 tea. So there were 2 words that she could say. The other one was she could say water. She said wawa for water. So there were like 3 words that she said. And on her first birthday, she began to walk. So she was walking by the time she was 1, But then at 19 months, so this is a little over a year and a half, an illness which left Helen permanently blind and deaf just plunged her into a world without appearances or sound. And Helen, in her autobiography, said it's sort of like she just sank into a mist of unconsciousness, like going back to being a newborn child. She couldn't remember. She lost everything that she remembered. It was just all misty. She said the one thing, even after her illness, she remembered this wawa. She didn't know what it meant at all, but she remembered that she could say wawa, and sometimes she would just say wawa, had no idea what it was, no idea. In 1886, Helen's mother and father began a search for help for their young daughter that included referrals by a number of well-known East Coast physicians and specialists working with deafblind children. Eventually, Anne Sullivan, a visually impaired, she had been blind herself, nearly blind as a kid, a visually impaired 20-year-old alumna of the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, was asked to become Keller's instructor. And she arrived at the Keller's Alabama household in 1887, 3 months before Helen's 7th birthday. What Anne Sullivan encountered was a child who was not only deaf and blind, but unable to speak or communicate except through very primitive gestures and guttural noises or sounds that she would make. Helen could only interact through her senses of smell, taste, and touch. And as she got older, she became increasingly frustrated and difficult to handle. Remember, she was when she was, 6 months old, she was very bright. So she had a good mind, but, she was just in a fog, right? So she knew that she was different from everyone else, because she would later write in her autobiography, she said, this is a quote, "Sometimes I stood between two persons who were conversing, and she would touch their lips. And she knew that they were doing something with their lips to get what they wanted. So she didn't understand, and she was really angry. She was vexed. And she said, I moved my lips and I gesticulated frantically, but nothing happened. You know, so nothing happened. And she made her so angry that she would kick and scream and until she was exhausted, she said. She just kicked and screamed until she was exhausted. She was so frustrated. So Helen was a very strong, active child, 7, just about 7, very indifferent to consequences. Quote, she said, quote, I knew my own mind well enough, she wrote, and always had my own way, even if I had to fight tooth and nail for it, which she did. Anne Sullivan, not more than a week after meeting Helen, wrote in a letter back to the director of the Perkins Institute for the Blind, where she had come from.
Mhm.
She said about Helen, quote, she has tyrannized over everybody, her mother, her father, the servants, and like all tyrants, she holds tenaciously to her divine right to do as she pleases. If she ever failed to get what she wanted, it was because of her inability to make the vassals of her household understand what it was. So the kid was running the place. You know, she was smart. She was
Right.
smart, and you know, she knew what she wanted, and she would just kick and scream till she got it. So that's it's the spirit of resistance in Helen was very, very strong. She was a strong girl. Anne Sullivan at one point wrote, you know, she's like a racehorse or a colt. I mean, she's bounding and she's strong, and it's hard to contain her.
Mhm.
Um, so when she became frustrated and confused, she would exhibit flashes of uncontrolled behavior and fits of temper, and afterwards break down in tears and physical exhaustion. Helen's need for a way to communicate became so frustrating for her that these outbursts occurred daily, sometimes hourly. And this is the situation that Anne Sullivan came into. The members of the household were all willing to give in to Helen just to hold the peace,
Mhm.
except occasionally for an older brother named James, who would, you know, not agree with everybody that they should be doing that, you know, letting Helen do this. So the family had learned to accommodate her unruly behavior, and they really didn't know what else to do. So now I'm going to get into Anne Sullivan's story and the causes and conditions that arise that make a great teacher. So Anne Sullivan herself suffered from she was nearly blind as a child, and she had a very traumatic upbringing. And she survived it, becoming very tough, very resilient, and a very determined young woman. It could have gone the other way, but it didn't with her. Her parents emigrated from Ireland to the United States in the mid-1800s during the Irish potato famine. They settled in a small town near Springfield, Massachusetts. And Anne, who was born in 1866, was the eldest of 3 children. So she had a younger brother and an even younger sister. When she was 5 years old, she contracted a bacterial disease called eye disease called trachoma. And she had many painful infections that over time made her nearly blind. When she was 8, her mother died of tuberculosis, which left her father with this nearly blind child, a little boy, and a baby girl. And he felt like he couldn't handle it, so he abandoned them. Um, uh, he he died. Her mother died from tuberculosis. So in 1876, so now I'm talking. Here's the unfolding of karma for Anne Sullivan. In 1876, when Anne was 10, she and her younger brother Jimmy were sent by her father to a rundown and overcrowded almshouse in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, which is like 19 miles northwest of Boston. The The younger daughter, the little girl was, the father brought her to an aunt to live with the aunt. So Helen and Jimmy were now at this Tewksbury almshouse.
Me and.
Anne and Jimmy was now at the Tewksbury almshouse. Yeah, sorry, Anne. When she was, yeah, it was the policy of the Tewksbury almshouse to keep women and men and boys and girls separated in different facilities, in different quarters. But Anne begged them not to separate her from her little brother Jimmy. It was all she had, and Jimmy also had a weak hip, and she didn't want Jimmy to be left alone. So they agreed, the almshouse put them together, but they put them together in a facility for ill and insane women. So this 10-year-old and 7-year-old were put into this group of insane and ill women. And that's where they were. And remained, and within 4 months of their arrival, Jimmy died of tuberculosis, which was terribly traumatic for Helen. She had no one now.
Yeah.
And she really loved Jimmy. After her brother's death, she stayed at the Tewksbury almshouse, and she underwent 2 unsuccessful eye operations at the city infirmary. A year later, in 1877, when Anne was 11 years old, she was sent from the Tewksbury almshouse to the Sisters of Charity Hospital in Lowell, Massachusetts, where she had a 3rd unsuccessful eye operation. For 5 months then, she helped the nuns in the wards and went on community errands while she waited for a 4th eye operation in July of that year, which was again unsuccessful. So she's now had 4 operations on her eyes, and she's still, nearly dead. So after nearly 6 months away from Tewksbury, Anne was returned to the almshouse, kicking and screaming. She now fully realized, after spending time at the Sisters of Charity, she now fully realized the horrors of the place, of the Tewksbury almshouse. This time, instead of returning her to the area with predominantly ill and insane women, they put her into the facility that was for unwed mothers and pregnant women and prostitutes. So here you have this 11-year-old girl now with unwed mothers, prostitutes, and pregnant women in this facility. And many years later, she wrote an essay of her thoughts, and the essay was entitled "Foolish Remarks of a Foolish Woman." And what she said was, "I have endured much physical pain, and I can feel real pity for anyone who suffers. The misfortunes of the disinherited of the world rouse in me not only compassion, but a fierce indignation." So this experience of what she saw, instead of beating her down, it made her more determined. It made her very compassionate for people who suffered. She could see it. She could see the problem. And she was, she had very little tolerance for anybody who treated people unjustly or used them for profit or anything like that. So now we get into the horrible sufferings of cyclic existence. And I'm going to talk about the Tewksbury almshouse. As a result of reports of cruelty to inmates at the Tewksbury almshouse, including sexually perverted practices and cannibalism, the Massachusetts Board of State Charities had already begun an investigation into the institution by the time Anne got back. The investigation was led by Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, then chairman of the board of the state charities in Massachusetts, and Samuel Gridley Howe, the founder of the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston. Samuel Gridley Howe's wife was Julia Ward Howe, who wrote America the Beautiful. So that Samuel Gridley Howe, who was the director of the Perkins Institute for the Blind, and this Sanborn guy, who was the director of the committee. The atrocities revealed, wait a minute. Okay, wait a minute. All right, the true story of the Tewksbury almshouse sheds light on a harsh and terrifying picture of the facility in the 1870s and early 1880s. Hearings were held before the Committee on Charitable Institutions in 1883, with the governor of Massachusetts leading the charge. So now, just think of this, what I'm going to say, and recognize that this is the kind of the nature of the suffering of samsara. This is a very good analogy for where the depths of suffering samsara can go to. The atrocities revealed in the hearings included deliberate neglect, starvation, grave robbing, the killing of infants through starvation and through over-medicating them with morphine and whiskey. The nurses would give the babies morphine and whiskey, not food. Inmates were housed under horrible conditions. Their human skin was tanned into leather for sale. And the inmates' only remaining clothing and personal possessions that they arrived with were confiscated at their arrival for personal use by the staff, or to be sold to the public. So any of their personal items, their precious belongings, as soon as they got there, all taken away, they were given rags, and this stuff was sold. Or even, some of the dresses were worn by the staff at the facility. And what this reminded me of, I couldn't help but think of the Nazi concentration camps.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but think of it. So I'll continue. Dr. John Dixwell of Boston testified in the hearings that he had graduated from Harvard Medical School in 1873, and that during his 3 years there, he saw and knew of several hundred bodies each year of infants who were brought to the medical school for dissection. The students obtained the bodies from a Mr. Andrews, who fixed the price at $3 to $5 per infant body. Dr. Dixwell said that Mr. Andrews told him that the bodies came from the Tewksbury almshouse. And Dr. Dixon said that some of the dissected infants showed that they had died from starvation.
Mm-hmm.
And these horrors have been going on for many, many years. Frank Butler and his wife were in charge of the insane ward at the almshouse from 1876 to 1879, during the time when Anne and Jimmy were inmates there. He testified that patients would be left for days without food, were unattended by a physician when they were sick. This is what happened to Jimmy. And some had holes eaten in their heads by vermin which crawled around on their beds. The patients, there were about 70 in all patients, were bathed with no change of water, even though many of them had running sores. So that's the picture of the horrors of samsara that Anne Sullivan had firsthand experience with. So now we go into her teacher training. In 1880, Anne began her studies at the Perkins School for the Blind because she had pleaded with the director, please take me out of here, I want to go to this school, and they did.
How did she get to the Perkins School?
When the director of the committee that was investigating Tewksbury, they came and she saw him and she ran up to him, she pleaded with him, take me to the Perkins Institute for the Blind.
That's part of the story.
Right, because the guy who came with the director was.
That's not in the story.
Yes, it is, I said it, you didn't hear it. Samuel Ridley Howe, the husband of Julia Ward Howe, who wrote America the Beautiful, was the director of the Perkins School for the Blind, and he came with the director of the committee.
I just didn't hear that she begged him.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I'm telling you,
right now.
well, she did actually, I can tell you, yeah, she pleaded with him. So she wound up at the Perkins School for the Blind.
See, because when you call about causes and conditions, her pleading with him.
Right.
Having happened.
You must have missed that when I said it.
Sorry.
And it's important, see, even the stories, we miss things. Okay, so Anne began her studies in 1880. Her first years at Perkins were humiliating for her because she was very, her language wasn't very good. She hadn't been raised to have manners. And her experiences were really, really rough. So she was kind of seen by everybody as kind of rough and not refined and things like that. You know, she was very strong-willed to
Yeah.
very, very determined. So she managed to connect with a few teachers, and she made progress with her learning. During her time at Perkins, Anne did have a series of eye operations that helped to improve her vision significantly. So she had to wear very dark glasses, but she could, you know, she could look like this, up really close to see words, and so she could read, and she needed, she could make out things, you know. While she was at Perkins, now this is important here too, she befriended Laura Bridgman. Laura Bridgman was a deafblind woman with whom Anne shared a cottage that was owned by the Perkins School. Bridgman, who was 50 years old at the time, had been famous in her youth as the first deafblind child to gain a significant education in the English language at Perkins. So she was similar to Helen Keller and had learned the English, she had learned to communicate through the Perkins School. The well-known English author, Charles Dickens, upon visiting the Perkins School in 1842, wrote very enthusiastically about Laura's success at Perkins in his journal called American Notes. Following the publication of Dickens' journal, Laura Bridgman became famous around the world. Famous around the world at the time. Before Helen Keller ever became world famous, right. Laura Bridgman was, because of Charles Dickens' reports on her. However, by the 1850s, her fame had declined. In Laura's later years, she was primarily dependent upon the Perkins School to supply her with room and board, which she was why she was in the cottage. And she did earn some spending money from selling her crocheted doilies and purses and embroidered handkerchiefs. It's something she had learned to do when she was a girl. While Anne was living with Laura, she learned finger spelling, you know, signs that you would spell, put into your hands, you know, D, O, L, L for doll. You know, so she learned this from Laura Bridgman, and that's how they communicated. In June of 1886, and this is amazing when you think of Anne and what she went through. No education. In June of 1886, at age 20, Anne Sullivan graduated as the highest performing student of her graduating class at Perkins School for the Blind. Wow. And this is what she said in her valedictorian address to the class. Quote, "Fellow graduates, duty bids us go forth into active life. Let us go cheerfully, hopefully, and earnestly, and set ourselves to find our special part. When we have found it, willingly and faithfully perform it. For every obstacle we overcome, every success we achieve, tends to bring man closer to God." Remember, definition of God, closer to God, and make life more as God would have it. That's the end of the quote. So she was inspired to go out. So now we go to the part of the path that we're all on, where we search for guidance and help. And we go back to the Kellers. So in the same year she graduated, in 1886, Helen Keller's mother, Kate, inspired by the account of Charles Dickens in his American Notes of the successful education of the deaf-blind girl, Laura Bridgman, persuaded her husband, Arthur, to take young Helen to a prominent eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist in Baltimore for advice. So Helen and her father, Captain Heller, went off to Baltimore to see what they could find, see if they could find any help. The specialist referred Mr. Keller and his daughter to Alexander Graham Bell. Alexander Graham Bell later became a friend of Helen Keller's. Alexander Graham Bell was working with deaf children at the time, and Bell advised Helen's father to contact the Perkins School for the Blind, because that's where Laura Bridgman had been educated. Now we go to the director of the school. His name, he was a Greek guy. His name was Michael Anagnos. He was the school's director. And Anne, of course, was the class valedictorian.
Mhm.
She was the highest performer of the class. So the director, this guy, Michael Anagnos, asked Anne Sullivan, who had not ever yet met Helen or her father or anything like that, he asked her to become Helen Keller's instructor.
How did you learn about Helen Keller?
Because Alexander Graham Bell sent Helen's dad to the in Perkins Institute for the Blind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's where,
Well, and you just didn't link that he went there and then.
or he wrote, he contacted them, whatever.
Contacted them
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah, he contacted them. Because that was based on what Alexander Graham Bell told him, yeah. As a present for Helen. So Anne thought, all right, I'll bring a present to Helen. I'll bring a present when I go. As a present, she brought along with her a doll that was wearing clothing that was embroidered and stitched by Lord Richmond.
Mm.
And now we get into the part of our personal path where we start to move from the darkness of ignorance into the light of awareness and understanding. The hardships experienced by Anne Sullivan had forged a young woman who was tough, smart, obviously, outspoken, and a resilient survivor. She had managed to transform the emotional and physical scars of her own suffering into compassionate action and the wish to help others who suffered under similar circumstances. Because of her experience at Tewkesbury Almshouse, she had developed, in her own words, a fierce indignation for those who treated others unjustly and profited at their expense. So, almost as soon as she arrived at the Keller's household, she began to argue with Helen's parents about the Civil War and the fact that their families had used other human beings as slaves and profited from it. And of course, you can imagine the reaction of, Captain Heller, the Confederate, and
Yeah.
Helen's mother, whose father was a Confederate chief general. They still had black people, working at where they
And
lived.
that's-
They had
yeah.
cooked, there were little kids, they weren't
Yeah.
slaves, but they lived with them. And so it was uncomfortable for,
Say the least.
to say the least, yeah. However, Anne quickly connected with Helen because of her own experiences as a child, and could recognize that she could probably be able to help Helen. She immediately began to instruct Helen in how to communicate by spelling words into her hand, and she began with the present that she had brought to Helen, which was a doll, and she spelled into her hand DOLL. Of course, Helen didn't know what anything. I mean, Helen was just feeling this in her hand and, feeling the doll and stuff like that. But Helen couldn't comprehend that every object she could touch and taste and smell had a word which labeled and identified that object. So as Anne tried to teach Helen different words for different objects, Helen became so frustrated that she would sometimes throw the objects, occasionally breaking them, which is exactly what she did with the doll that Anne brought her.
Right.
She just threw it on the floor, the doll's head smashed, Anne had to sweep up the pieces, and then she just, and didn't pay any attention to that. She just went back to working with Helen. Despite the tantrums, Helen quickly began imitating Anne's hand gestures. She was bright, she's smart. So Anne would do these things, put an object in her hand, then do something with her hand, and Helen would just copy. Helen later wrote in her autobiography, I didn't know that I was spelling a word or even that words existed.
Right.
I was simply making my fingers go in monkey-like imitation. So now we get to the part of the path that we all go through, and this is called, I'm titling this, the Battle Royal of the Ego. Only a few days later, after a knockdown drag-out with Helen at breakfast, Anne wrote the following in a letter to the director of the Perkins School. Quote, if this wasn't in writing, I don't think I would have believed it, really. Quote, I had a battle royal with Helen this morning. Helen's table manners are appalling. She puts her hands in our plates and just helps herself. And when the dishes are passed, she grabs them and takes out whatever she wants. This morning at breakfast, I would not let her put her hand in my plate. She persisted, and a contest of wills followed. Naturally, the family was much disturbed and left the dining room. I locked the dining room door and proceeded to eat my breakfast, though the food was almost choking me. Helen was lying on the floor, kicking and screaming and trying to pull my chair out from under me. Have you ever seen the movie that they made, called The Miracle Worker?
I think
It's
so.
bringing back.
Yeah, little.
When I saw the movie, I thought, oh, the writer, he just put this in for dramatic effect. I had no idea.
It was a real.
It was a real thing.
event.
Yeah, because, Helen Keller was just like, oh, wonderful Helen Keller, right? So Helen's lying on the floor, kicking and screaming and trying to pull Anne's chair out from under her as she's kicking and screaming. She kept this up for half an hour. Then she got up, and she wanted to see what she was doing, what Anne was doing. I let her see that I was eating, but I did not let her put her hand in my plate. She pinched me, and I slapped her. And she pinched me, and I slapped her again. And she pinched me, and I slapped her every time she pinched me. So there's this fight going on. If you look at the movie, it's like, what are they? It's like a boxing match or something. It's unbelievable. And the doors are locked, the family's outside,
They just hear the commotion in the room.
Yeah. So then Helen went all around the table to see who was there, and finding no one but me, she seemed bewildered. Because she couldn't hear that everybody was
Right,
out.
everyone had left, yeah.
Yeah. After a few minutes, she came back to her plate and began to eat her breakfast with her fingers. I gave her a spoon, which she threw on the floor. I forced her out of the chair and made her pick it up. Finally, I succeeded in getting her back in her chair again and held the spoon in her hand, compelling her to take up the food with it and put it in her mouth. Then we had another tussle over folding her napkin. When she had finished, she threw it on the floor and ran toward the door. Finding it locked, she began to kick and scream all over again. It was another hour before I succeeded in getting her napkin folded. So this was an hour and a half in the dining room, kicking and screaming and biting and slapping and pulling chairs from under. And I mean, it's just, if you watch the movie, and I recommend you watch
Yeah.
the movie, it is a jaw-dropping scene, and you cannot take your eyes off it, and you cannot believe the two actresses are so good.
Mhm.
They're so spontaneous, and it just seems like, I don't believe what I'm seeing. I think I even went, when it was all over. So now we go to the part of the path where we sort of leave the familiarity of our home and the things we're accustomed to for a solitary place. Now, this is not everybody does this. Some people will take retreats and things like that. But this is the part of the story which aligns with that aspect of the path. So, following the battle royal, Anne convinced Helen's parents to let her and Helen work alone together for several weeks without their interaction, which Anne felt was undermining her ability to help Helen. Anne had made up her mind that she could do nothing with Helen in the midst of the family, who always allowed her to do exactly as she pleased. She felt Helen ought to be separated from the family for a few weeks at the very least, and that she must learn to depend on and obey her teacher before any headway could be made. Anne sort of walked around the property, and she chose an old little garden house in a secluded area of the family property with surroundings that Helen was not familiar with. Helen would have to rely entirely on her teacher without relying on her habitual patterns of behavior to get her way. And plus the emotional attachment she had developed for her home and family, which was the only world she knew. Anne was taking her away from all of that. So aside from the daily necessities like eating and sleeping, her focus would have to be on her teacher and her awareness of the objects and hand gestures that Anne was continually thrusting upon Helen's limited senses. So they get there, I mean, they took a carriage ride, and Helen was all very happy about the carriage ride. They take a carriage ride out to this garden place, and her father and everybody's there in the carriage, and Helen get out, and they get in the home, and Helen begins to realize that she's been left alone there with her nemesis, with this person. And so when Helen realized she'd been left alone with her teacher in an unfamiliar face, and this is a quote from Anne, who wrote back to her teacher. She said, "Helen kicked and screamed herself into a sort of stupor." She did eat her supper, but she refused to let Anne touch her. Then they had another terrific battle at bedtime, when Helen realized that she and this lady, her teacher, would be sharing the bed. The struggle lasted for 2 hours.
Oh my God.
Another fight in the little garden cottage.
Yeah.
Right. Anne wrote to the director that she had never seen such strength, endurance, and obstinance in a child. But Anne said, "I'm stronger, and I'm just as obstinate, and I succeeded in getting Helen on the bed." Although what Helen did was she curled up as close to the edge of the bed as possible and turned the other way. That's in the movie too, and I didn't believe that, but
Yeah.
now I do. Over the following days, Helen settled down, but was clearly homesick. She kept going to the door as if she expected someone, and every now and then she'd touch her cheek like this, which was a sign for her mother. This meant mother to Helen, and she'd shake her head sadly. Gradually, things improved. Helen learned a few new words with her fingers, but had no idea how to use them or what they meant. After several days, when Anne would give Helen objects, the names of which she had learned, Helen would spell them without hesitation. So, she'd put, a necklace in front of Helen, and
Yeah.
Helen would go, "Yeah, no, there, yeah."
Gosh, necklace, yeah.
But not really not connecting it in the way she needed to. After a week with Anne, Helen began to change. She would sit next to Anne. Remember, she was getting no contact with her family. Her family actually did come to observe,
Right, but she didn't know they were
but she
there.
didn't know they were there, and they sort of stayed outside the cottage and looked in through the window, just to make sure, there was no brawls going on, and that their daughter wasn't being beaten, right?
Right.
But they kept an eye, and they could see the parents. They could see the progress that was happening with Helen. Helen began to change. She would sit next to Anne and seemed relatively serene and happy. She would even let Anne kiss her. And if she was in a particularly gentle mood, she would sit in Anne's lap for a minute, but no more than that. Anne wrote back to the director, quote, "The little savage has learned her first lesson in obedience and finds the yoke easy." Helen continued to learn new words for objects from Anne, but still had no idea yet what the words meant in relation to the objects, and that everything had a name. So after I didn't include this in because I didn't think, I was really late at night and I wasn't sure we were going to have time, but we are going to have time. And this is a very, very, very important part of the story. So Helen's parents saw, wow, Helen's folding her napkin, she's sitting properly, she's not making noise, she's sitting in the left. We want her home. We want her. So 2 weeks had gone. Anne wanted more than 2 weeks. She said, "Give me a month. Give me a month. Please give me a month."
Right.
And they said, "No, this is great. You've done a terrific job." They were very happy with Anne. They were very happy with Helen. And so they came in. Helen was thrilled. They brought her back to the house. And so if any of you have ever gone on a retreat and you think, oh, you get back from the retreat, you go, that was amazing. What an amazing experience. I learned so much. It was so wonderful. And everybody's experiences. Within maybe a week or so, all those wonderful realizations are starting to fade a little bit, and you find you're going back to the same old patterns of behavior, the same old habits that you have, right? And this is an essential part of the path we're on, that we have to learn how to skillfully deal with this. So what happened was they get home, and this is not, I mean, maybe not more than 2 hours later. I mean,
Right.
Helen didn't wait. So it's dinner time again. Now they're in the dining room again. It's dinner time. Helen's sitting at her chair, and Anne puts napkin up on Helen's, pins the napkin to her chest.
Mhm.
So Helen's sitting there. She takes the napkin off and throws it on the floor
Oh.
and sits there. And Anne goes, all right, she's testing me here. She's testing me. So Anne goes back, takes the napkin up off the floor, puts it onto Helen's neck, and sits back down. Helen waits a little bit, pulls the napkin off, throws it on the floor, and sits there. So then Anne gets up, takes her plate away, and starts to take Helen out of the room. And Captain, however, not wanting to see a repeat of what happened before, he stands up and said, "No child of mine is going to go without food just because she misbehaved."
Right.
So Anne said, okay, and sat back down and just let Helen have her way. Now, the movie truncates this whole scene very quickly and goes to the end, but there's a very, very, very important part that comes up. So Anne waited, and she waited until the next day. And the next day, Helen had teaching with Anne. Helen would go upstairs to Anne's room, and they would have teachings. And the way she did it, the way Anne did it, is she'd take a bunch of objects and put them on the floor in front of Helen, so Helen could feel the objects. And Helen would then, they had things that she had worked with, and so she knew if she would sign, correctly, there was a little piece of cake next to the object, which Anne would give to Helen. Helen could take it and have that piece of cake.
Oh.
It was sort of like, when I was learning how to play the piano, if I played it correctly, my mother would give me M&Ms.
Yeah.
It was the same kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So Anne, Helen gets up there into the room, and it worked. Yeah, it's like, wow.
No joke.
Yeah, I'm gonna practice more. I got some more. Yeah. I was little, I was like 5 or something. So Helen sits down, and the objects are in front of her, right? She's feeling, and she starts to, something's wrong. The cake stopped. The little pieces of cake aren't next to the objects. So then Anne had taken a napkin, from the dining room with her. So she took the napkin and she pinned it onto Helen's chest, blouse. And she then pulled the napkin off, threw it on the floor, and made Helen, feel it that she had done that. Taking the napkin and throwing it on the floor. And then she took Helen's hands, put it in her face, and she went like this, which Helen knew meant no.
Right.
No. So Helen, knowing that she would get cake.
Oh,
If she agreed, Helen, touched the napkin, and then she went, like, no, I won't do that. And Anne had a big piece of cake ready to give her, which she gave to Helen. And from then on, over the next, weeks, Helen kind of would
play the game.
And this is an example of what is called skillful means. A really good teacher knows that every student is different. They have unique things about them. And what the Buddhist teachers will do is they will size up the qualities that they see in a particular student. And they will use skillful means and train that student in methods that are appropriate to them.
Right.
That are going to work for them. That is a sign of a really good teacher. It's not cookie cutter for everybody.
Right.
They find skillful means for every student they're working with. And this is absolutely the case in Buddhism, in Buddhist practice. I've experienced this myself with teachers. So what Anne was using was very skillful means. We're giving cake to some other kid. That may not work. It may just, make it worse. This was working for Helen. So what happened? She then continually. So I wanted to explain that because that is a super important part of the whole process. So So now we get to the part where it's the direct realization, having a direct realization of what actually is going on.
So at this point, Anne Sullivan is teaching Helen Keller to replicate these,
Replicate the things,
but
and
Helen hasn't put it together.
no, Helen hasn't put it together, but
So
going along with
like
Anne,
reading words, but you don't really get.
yeah, it would
Don't
be like,
comprehend.
it would be like somebody, put this in your hand and said, "Akopetya."
It would be like somebody saying emptiness and dependent arising.
Or it would be like when we try to read about emptiness and dependent arising in
Right.
some of these books, you go,
Okay,
I see the
understand that.
words,
I don't
but
know
I
what
don't-
it means, but I get the words.
I don't, I understand, but I don't know what that's saying.
Yeah.
So Helen was being told what everything was, but it was just,
It's like
Yeah.
we're being told that emptiness is this dependent arising,
so.
everything's
Are we doing good?
impermanent and all the
Yeah,
things
we're
we're
doing
being
fine.
told.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, Anne continued then to constantly, everything they did, wherever they were going together, walking around the yard, everything, she was constantly spelling these words. She put Helen's hand, she'd give her the object, or put her hand on a branch, or whatever it was, an egg with a chicken coming out of it, whatever. And she would then spell the thing to Helen. And this was just constantly happening. It wasn't just during class time, it was all the time. She really upped it. And Helen was, going along with it because she was getting cake. Helen didn't know what the spellings meant. Helen knew that particular hand signs were associated with particular objects. But what she didn't realize is that they symbolized the idea of what the object was. She wasn't understanding the idea of what the object was. So the words mug, M-U-G, and milk, M-I-L-K, had given Helen more trouble than all of the rest. Anne was noticing that there was a problem with mug and milk, because whenever Helen would feel the mug, she'd do this, like drink, drink, drink. Whenever Helen would know that it was milk, then she'd pantomime drinking. So she thought that mug and milk meant drink. She didn't think that mug and milk
Went together like the mug holds.
the mug, yeah, she wasn't thinking that. She thought these little things this means drink. Yeah, drink, I want to drink, give me the mug, I want to drink. So Helen knew that she had to do something about it. So one morning, well, the thing about drink, why Anne could not teach Helen the word drink is because drink is nothing you can touch or feel or hold.
Right.
It's not an object that she couldn't give Helen something
It's
that's
an action.
it's an
You can't
action.
Show someone who's
Right,
blind.
you can't feel it.
Yeah.
So, but she knew that there was something there about drink with the mug and the milk. So one morning, when Helen was washing, she was using water to wash. Helen wanted to know what the name for the water was. And the way she did it is, what she did whenever Helen wanted to know the hand symbols for something, she would point to the object and then point to, she would pat Anne's hand. So she'd point to the object and then pat Anne's hand, like,
Like,
show me, what is it? So Anne's Helen's washing herself, and she points to the water and she pats Anne's hand. And Anne immediately goes W-A-T-E-R, into her hand and didn't think much about it. Then later, it occurred to Anne that with the help of this new word, water, she might be able to straighten out the mug milk confusion that Helen was having. So this is what Anne wrote when she wrote back to the director. She said, quote, "We went out to the pump house and I made Helen hold her mug under the spout while I pumped. As the cold water gushed forth, filling the mug with water, I spelled W-A-T-E-R into Helen's free hand. The word coming so close upon the sensation of the cold water rushing over her hand seemed to startle Helen. She dropped the mug and she stood as if she was transfixed. Now, in Helen's autobiography, The Story of My Life, Helen recalls the same moment. Quote, I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motion of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that WATER meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. The living word awakened in my soul, gave it light, hope, set it free. So then Anne's telling of the moment continues. Quote, a new light came into her face. She spelled water several times. Then she dropped on the ground and asked for its name. Like,
What is that?
what's this? But suddenly, instead of the ground, she turned around to Anne and touched her and wanted to know, what's your name? So Anne spelled teacher with a capital T, by the way.
Ooh.
Teacher into her hand.
How do you capitalize?
I don't know, but they have, I mean, you know, they can do everything. But what Anne says is I spelled capital T-E-H-E-A-C-H-R. Just then, the nurse brought Helen's little baby sister into the pump house. And Helen felt that the baby was there, and she spelled baby. She spelled B-A-B-Y and pointed to the nurse. So all the way back to the house, this is still Helen's quote, all the way back to the house, she was highly excited and learned the name of every object she touched. Helen was so, and then that's the end of the quote. So Helen was so overjoyed at having her mind set free by this realization. She quickly made Anne sign into her hand the names of all the other familiar objects in her world, and she got it. So
What's different about, because she's still with.
she wasn't making the connection with this stands for an idea of what
This object is.
it's difficult for us to.
It's a subtle,
It's difficult, and this is why having a direct
Yeah.
realization of emptiness is hard for us to even like what are we talking about here?
Right.
And when we read about emptiness, it's like
But once she had the realization,
once she had the
then you
realization,
can't go back to not knowing.
exactly,
And applied it to everything.
she applied it to everything, and this corresponds to what they're telling us when we actually finally get it and have this direct realization of what the teachers have been trying to get into our head in every way possible. It all of a sudden it all opens up. You get it, and you will not go back to experiencing things in the way you experienced them before. So now we get on to the part of this story which is about liberation and awakening to our full potential. We're doing real. Helen and Anne became lifelong friends and companions. Helen attended the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston, and she was eventually admitted to Radcliffe College of Harvard University, graduating as a member of Phi Beta Kappa from Radcliffe. She was that smart. And at Radcliffe, they wouldn't let Anne in the room. They were very strict. Nobody could be in the room with Helen. Helen had to do the whole test on herself. She had Braille. She had learned how to read Braille. Helen did it all on her own without help. And so they had to let her into the school. They first thought they weren't going to do it. She became the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. She learned to speak. She learned to actually speak and use inflection and tones. And it was difficult. I've heard her, I've looked online, and it's difficult to follow exactly what she's saying, but somebody who was used to it
Right.
knew. And so Anne was quite used to it. And so when Helen would speak to audiences, you know, Helen would say the thing and then Anne would repeat it and people understood. And it was quite an amazing thing. She learned to speak, and she spent much of her life giving speeches and lectures on aspects of her life, bringing a message of happiness, optimism, hope, and motivation to people who heard her.
Wow.
She was a world famous speaker and author. I mean, now we get into her accomplishments, and this is why I'm saying this is an analogy for liberation and then the awakening of our full potential. This was, I mean, we think of what
Right,
Helen
and she
was.
was capable of all that before, she just didn't have the means to do it.
Right. She needed the teacher to unlock all of that for her.
Mhm.
So she was a world famous speaker and author, an advocate of people with disabilities, a suffragist, a pacifist. She was active in politics for the benefit of those who suffered throughout society. She campaigned politically in support of the working class and the poor. She supported the NAACP. She helped to found the American Civil Liberties Union, and she spoke out against war and military interventionism. This is back at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
She was friends with Alexander Graham Bell, Charlie
Mhm.
Chaplin, and Mark Twain.
Wow.
And it was Mark Twain who described Anne Sullivan as, quote, a miracle worker. So now we get to the miracle worker. In 1957, the American playwright and novelist William Gibson began a cycle of dramatic works called The Miracle Worker, based on Helen Keller's 1903 autobiography, The Story of My Life. Now, I would say, I looked up on, there's an Internet Archive site, and that's how I found all of these quotes. And at the back of the book, The Story of My Life, Anne Sullivan gave permission to reproduce her letters. So what it gives you is from both sides, you know, what Helen was experiencing and what Anne was experiencing. It's invaluable to read it. It's really, really interesting. The Miracle Worker first appeared as a television drama in 1957. William Gibson then adapted that for a Tony Award-winning Broadway production in 1959 and an Oscar-winning film in 1962, both of which featured Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke portraying Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller, respectively.
Yeah, the 67 one.
I remember
62.
when I must have been 8 or 9. I remember I was just spellbound watching this thing on TV because basically I'm looking at a girl, so a young kid who I could so identify with because she's, you know, 8 or 9, right? I mean, Patty Duke at the time, she wasn't 7.
Yeah.
Patty Duke was a little older, but she looked like she was a little girl. So I'm watching all of this, just I couldn't keep. And when the two actresses are on screen, and Kavita and I watched this last week because I wanted to see it again.
Mhm.
It's like you cannot take their eyes off of them. They're just really astonishing in their parts, both of them. They are so natural, and there's such emotion and there's such physicality. The scene in the dining room
Mhm.
takes your breath away. You just can't believe. I mean, you rarely see anything that spontaneous and raw, even now.
Mhm.
The spontaneity of it was so believable, and I just thought, oh, this is, you know, the author, the playwright just did all this for dramatic effect. It can't have been true. I was amazed when I found out yesterday, just reading Anne's description,
Right.
that the whole thing was true. All of it was true, except the playwright truncated the end.
Right.
You know, from the time she was throwing her napkin down to, you know, discovering water, the meaning of water. And so he did an excellent job. And you know, there are some things that aren't great about the movie, particularly the characters of the mother and father are kind of two-dimensional and, you know, not as well fleshed out as they could have been, and the director could have done a better job. I think the actors
Let's
were
talk to the
fine.
analogy between this and the path.
Yeah, hold on, but I want to get through this. But what I want to say is, I highly recommend that you watch it with this in mind, with
Right.
the analogy of the path in mind, because you can get from those two actresses, their performances are so good. They both won Academy Award for it.
Right.
They're so good that the emotion of what that transformation is comes through. At the very end of the movie, and this actually happened in real life as well, but it happened later. But at the very end of the movie, they show that Helen finally understands what LOVE means,
Right.
what the idea is, and she crawls into Anne's lap,
Mhm.
and she takes her hand and she goes, "Helen loves teacher,"
Oh, nice.
and back into Helen's hand went, "Teacher loves Helen.
Oh, nice.
And that's how the movie ends, and that actually happened later on when she and Anne were together.
Yeah.
Anne was explaining, because Helen was asking, what is love, what is love? And one of the things that Anne gave her was an analogy of clouds. She said, clouds, you can't actually grasp them and hold them, but they're essential to the way, you know, all of the world runs, and the way everything works. You have to have that. And she said, you have to have love. It's essential. You know, and so she was finally getting this across to Anne, and then Anne did that. Anne loves teacher, and teacher loves Anne.
Nice.
I mean, teacher loves Helen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was that. So now this teacher-student relationship, the aspect of the teacher-student relationship and the analogy in this story. Anne Sullivan died at the age of 70. So she lived a pretty good long life for them. She died at the age of 70 with her hand in Helen's hand.
Wow.
That's how she died. Helen devoted much of her later life to raising funds for the American Foundation for the Blind. Helen died in her sleep at her home in Connecticut at the age of 87.
Wow.
She was even alive when they made the movie, and she met Patty Duke, and she met Anne.
Oh, wow.
So her ashes, Helen's ashes, were interred at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., next to Anne Sullivan's ashes. So the story of Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan stands as a rich analogy for the isolated darkness and confusion of our primordial self-grasping ignorance, and the determined perseverance of our spiritual teachers to liberate us from that ignorance. When Helen finally and directly realized what her teacher had been trying to get across to her, she understood at once that she'd been given the key to unlock the darkness of her existence in such a way that it would never return.
Right.
And there's a wonderful symbolic thing in the movie. Helen, in one of the scenes, Helen locks Anne in her bedroom and takes the key.
Oh.
And so the Captain Keller has to get up on a ladder and get, Anne out of the room because Helen hid the key.
Right.
I mean, she knew what she was doing. So after the scene where Helen finally understands through the water experience,
Analogy, yeah.
everything comes to light. Helen goes and gets
The
the
key.
key and gives it to Helen. And gives it to Anne,
Yeah.
Saying, it's like,
Got it.
you unlocked this for me. It's such a great moment. It's so good.
Well, in Buddhism, they use the wild elephant when you put the rope around, and then the mind of the elephant is just bucking and rearing because it in this analogy, like Helen just bucking and rearing, like no. And then once the concept of why, when the mind settles down, and then you start having those realizations,
Right.
then your mind is calm and you're like, oh,
Yeah. Also, the thing I think we should also bear in mind is this idea of skillful means, the way the teachers use skillful means with us.
Right.
Because the same teacher is not going to treat each one of us in the same way.
Right.
They will suggest different things to us based on where they see that we're at. And I think it's important for us to take that on board actually with ourselves and begin to use skillful means with ourselves. To not, if we know that we have very, very, very strong habitual tendencies for something, to not beat ourselves up and kick and scream and cry, but go, okay, wait a minute, how can I skillfully deal with this? Not going, I will never eat another donut.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe
Just a quarter of a donut.
just a little bit, right? It's the way Anne worked with Helen with the cake.
Right.
So we need to learn how skillfully work with ourselves on this path.
Right.
Because it's not, this ego business is so primordial. As of course we've talked about before, the Buddha says it's beginningless.
Yeah.
So it's not going to just, after a retreat or two, or some classes with a teacher, it's just not gonna go hide under a rock and never come back again. It's
Right.
going to resurface, just like it did at the table with the napkin and Ellen.
That look how strong her grasping
Yeah,
at her desires were.
and that's the same as for all of us.
Right.
For all of us, that
Yeah.
grasping is that primordial, it's that strong. you know?
Yeah.
And it's important for us to remember this, not be hard on ourselves. Use skillful means, listen to our teachers, keep studying, So finally, what I want to say, I think.
One of the things that's the most moving to me, the pivotal thing that's moving to me is how, in our case, we can listen to the teachings for so many years and hear the words, have our teachers talk to us, have our teachers fly from India and talk to us, spend time with us, teach us. We hear the words, we hear the words, we hear the words, and it hasn't actually penetrated
No.
Well, something
until
that
it does.
Right,
you mentioned, you were talking about with the word water.
Yeah,
You said it became living. And so we seek knowledge and it comes to us in language and we read scripture and we love, all this stuff, but when it becomes living.
Yeah.
And even layers of knowledge, like this piece, it's alive, it's embodied. And then you read something else, it's like, okay, and you keep doing it, but when it becomes alive, it's
it becomes part of you.
it becomes part of you, and
My
that's,
impression for Helen, that moment when it became alive, it involved an entire shift of her experience of existence. It was like, and I think we'll know when we've had a shift.
yeah,
It's not,
Yeah.
I think we'll know.
That's what the all of the teachings say about emptiness. Once you've had that direct realization, even though you see the world the same way, you don't see it the same way. It's never, ever, ever the same again. You understand, you realize what's going on. And finally, when you attain complete enlightenment, you embody all of it. You not only know what's going on, but it appears to you that way. It appears the way it really is, rather than the way things are appearing to us now. There are two, and we're going to talk about this coming up. There are two kinds of cognitive awarenesses that are separate. They're not working together right now. When we achieve enlightenment, they come together. The two come together. So, but they say when you've had that direct experience, finally, you've embodied, like, whoa, it's part of you. I realize this now. You can never go back, and you never see the world the same way again.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So that's kind of what we have to look forward to. And I
The thing, not only at our side, the aha moment that we have to have. I have found that this movie and the story of Helen Keller, but seeing it in a different way, how my teachers must have been looking at me this whole time, especially Geshe Darpa and Geshe Nima, because I feel like both of them in some way have had an aha that I haven't had. I think both of them carry a direct experience, in my opinion. How do I know? Because I haven't, but I just imagine it's like we get it, because it's like when we're teaching babies stuff, but I think it's hard for us to imagine the way our existence will shift with as our insight to how things actually exist opens up.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just
another teacher I think
the
who
pages
has
for the teachers are just incredible, of the teachers.
Yeah. There's another teacher I think who's brilliant actually at skillful means is Venerable Robina.
Yeah.
She can be as hard-assed as any Anne Sullivan you ever met,
Yes.
and yet you know that Robina only wants what's best for you. You know that, you realize that, you recognize that, and she's very good at it. She's very, very clear. There's no mincing words with Robina, and I completely admire her for that. She's helped me quite a bit, as has obviously Geshe Dragpa, unbelievable, and Geshe Nima. The things that they have taught both of us, and the suggestions that they've made for us. They see where our strengths and weaknesses lie, and they know what they want to do is they want to build up the strengths,
Right.
you know. And that's what they do. So I kind of want to close with this. So this is what our lamas and spiritual teachers give to us through their incredible kindness and dedication to the spiritual path of compassion and wisdom. As emissaries of the Buddha's lineage, they connect us to the precious, inestimable Dharma teachings and practices taught by the Buddha. Our direct realization of those teachings and practices of wisdom and compassion awakens our heart and mind. And just like Helen Keller, it gives us light and hope, and it sets us free to benefit all beings who are lost in the dark.
Right.
And that's the beauty of this story, the analogy it has to the path we're on, the relationship we have with our spiritual teachers, you know. And I think it will help us in some of the more difficult times to remember this story. And really, I would suggest, even though there are, like I said, there are a few, I would say, flaws, but there are no flaws in the
Right.
performances of the two actresses.
Right.
When they're on screen, you cannot take your eyes off of them, and it's worth it. It's worth it for that. They get the message across
Well,
very clearly.
I think you mentioned this, that, Kovita mentioned too, the amount of patience our teachers and gurus have
Yeah.
for us in gaining these concepts. We also have to have equal patience with ourselves to gain those concepts.
Yes.
And when we fail, because we will,
Mhm.
because it will take time to fully grasp them, to allow ourselves the grace of failing, and then just learning from that mistake and try again.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
Wholeheartedly, I agree with what you just said. And that in itself is a skillful means
Right.
that we can apply. Patience with ourselves. Patience with ourselves. Because we are going to fall and we're going to make mistakes. And there is no choice, because that ego is going to find any nook and cranny.
Right.
To drop the napkin on the floor and reassert its power over the place.
Yeah,
You know.
right.
Well, right, and
Exactly.
there are actually two things going on. You've got the ego wanting its way, and then you have the darkness of ignorance.
Yeah.
Anne Sullivan was making shapes, but Helen didn't really know what that was about.
Mhm.
So she might have heard the words, so to speak,
Right.
but
Just like we do.
Yeah.
so you've got the ego wanting its way in conjunction with the darkness of ignorance.
Right.
Mhm.
Of ignorance of how things,
Truly exist.
the ultimate nature of reality. So
It's
you've got two things that are,
a huge thing to overcome. And what I think the example of Helen Keller shows us, my God, she overcame that
Well, right.
because of her teacher.
And we too have the
Yeah.
opportunity to overcome our obscurations and our ignorance.
just imagine, without a teacher.
Right.
How could you ever navigate such a thing without a
And
teacher?
even one way to think of ourselves is like we are kind of like Helen Keller. We just don't know it. Helen Keller didn't know how different she was.
Right.
She realized, people were doing things with their lips, but how could she know?
Right.
So now we've got the Wizard of Oz and the Miracle Worker.
Yeah, Wizard of Oz is really good. I need to
And
go over that.
Groundhog Day.
And Groundhog.
And Groundhog Day is funny.
As kind of Buddhist analogies.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What other movies and theaters out there that we can use to explain Buddhist concepts?
You could probably find any movie, and you could see, oh, I can see the ignorance here. I can see the grasping. I can see what they're doing.
No, those.
But those particular movies, I have got to go over the Wizard of Oz, because the
Again.
more I study it, the more I see what was going on there, and the hands, whatever, the inspiration
question.
around that.
Brian, why don't you research that?
Yeah.
Well,
We could have a movie
There's
series.
the
Yeah.
health movie, The Legend of Legend of
Bagger Vance, is it?
That we had to watch in a yoga training, and I can't, it was the whole,
I've never seen it.
it's pretty amazing. I would have to watch it again, because it wasn't a Buddhist perspective, but there's so much crossover. It was, it was in the flow and the field, and there was this teacher and concentration of hitting the golf ball, and there was a lot to that story. It's a beautiful story.
Yeah,
Well, Christopher, you did a wonderful,
Ah, magnificent.
narration of The Wizard of Oz with the research that you did about the writer of it. How he did have some Buddhist,
oh, he definitely did, yeah.
that he was either a practicing Buddhist or had exposure.
The woman he
to
studied with
Buddhism.
was a Mahayanist,
Exactly.
and this is back in the 1800s.
Right, exactly. So, it's interesting that there have been historically people in our culture trying to share with Western philosophy and ideals, the Buddhist path,
Right.
or the Mahayana Buddhist path.
This particular story is not trying to share
No,
the
it's
Buddhist
not.
path, but it is such a great analogy for it. You can
Right,
see it.
you can see it.
You can see it because the main character, Helen, is like Kavita said, just, it's not only being, ignorant of it's not only being blind and deaf, but being ignorant of what the teacher is even trying
Yeah.
to teach you. That's the situation we're in.
Right.
It takes a long time. And so we just have to be persistent with it and know that over time things will change. They will start to get clearer in our
Right.
minds. It has happened with me.
Right.
It's happened with Kavita. It's over 18 years or 19 years, whatever it's been. We're starting to be able to look at things that we didn't understand before and go, oh my God, I think I understand that.
Yeah.
And then the thing is, you go, how can I possibly explain that to anybody?
Right.
And that's the thing, that's the trick about being a teacher, is find a way that works for the people that you are working with, that will help them. And this is exactly what our teachers have done. It's exactly
Right.
what Anne Sullivan did with Helen Keller,
Right.
So it's, I think we should take heart. I think it's possible. I think we can do it. I think we just, keep, as Rabina says, keep on trucking.
Keep on going.
Okay. Shall we say our closing
Thank you,
briefs?
Christopher.
Yes, thank you, Christopher.
Yeah, I was happy to do this. This is a little different, telling a story, but stories are good. They're good to tell. They can stick with us and help us.
Right.
So, let's, down to the bottom of the second page, our regular ones, starting with may the precious Bodhi mind.
Okay,
Okay.
in English, yeah.
Yeah, in English. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. May the view of emptiness, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. And then the bottom of the last page, and this is the dedication to the teachers.
Mhm.
In all my lives, may I not be separated from true lamas, and so enjoy the splendor of Dharma, fully perfecting the virtues of levels and paths. May I speedily attain the state of Vajradhara. Yeah.
Whew. Thank you, thank you,
Yeah.
thank you.
So, watch the movie. It's on, what did we watch?
And that's Miracle.
The Miracle Worker.
The Miracle Worker.
Anne Bancroft and
Yep.
and Patty Duke. And it's interesting, and I was thinking, oh, Anne Bancroft, I bet you Anne Sullivan wasn't as pretty as Anne Bancroft. And there's an old picture of Anne Sullivan when she was 20,
And she's
beautiful. Pretty.
pretty.
She's pretty.
Yeah,
And Helen Keller was attractive too,
yeah.
So
Well, yeah.
we're sometimes mistaken in our assumptions about things.
Mhm.
Most things.
Of course, as they got older, and
Yeah.
they're old ladies.
Yeah, right.
That's what
Well, I
happens to
never
everybody.
thought about it one way or the other, if they were pretty or ugly.
No, but I was just surprised. I just was surprised.
Yeah, well, and then you
Yeah,
can
I
put
mean,
the
it's
layer of
great.
karma on top of that.
So-
They had physical beauty, but the environments in which way they were born into,
Yeah.
all that negative karma,
But the thing what happened, that particular karma made this amazing realization to occur.
Exactly.
So this is another thing we should take heart in.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean, if we think we have, I've got some bad karma, this and that, don't think that way.
No,
Realize that karma is sort of like when you're forging a piece of steel,
Yeah,
it is helping us to come to a realization.
the pressures and whatever.
Yeah, and so think of it that way. That's skillful means.
Yeah,
We need to learn to use our
experiences.
experiences that may seem like they're a suffering, or that they weren't pleasant, or whatever it may be, and use those, bring them into the path.
Right,
That's skillful. That's what we need to
Yes.
do.
In
exactly.
our world collectively,
Mm.
like when we see the breakdown of institutions and organizations and structures that it's like, oh no, this can't break down.
Right.
We
Yes,
don't know what is with the.
We don't know what is actually
What's gonna come in
gonna
its
arise
place.
because of it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. All right. I should end the recording. We are past time now for sure. Okay. Thank you, everybody on Zoom.
the Zoomlanders.
The Zoomlanders. Okay.
Bye, Claudia, see you later.
I got the recording. Oh, no. That's...
Hey, Griff.
Hey, Suze.
Hey, hi, Susie.
I see.
Hey.